Cowboy Bob's bank robberies have been called nearly perfect crimes, and they stumped the FBI for close to a year between 1991 and 1992. Witnesses described him as white, around 5'10" with a heavy-set build, and most of his face was obscured under a pair of large sunglasses and a tall white cowboy hat, except for his bushy gray beard. The hat is what led investigators to give him his nickname of Cowboy Bob. His first robbery was at the American Federal Bank in Irving, Texas. He walked up to the counter where he was greeted by the teller. Instead of replying to her, he handed her a note that read, "This is a bank robbery. Give me all of your money. No marked bills or die packs." The die packs refer to a radio-controlled anti-robbery device that, when activated, will stain the money and the robber with red dye. The frightened teller handed him all of the cash that she had, and he simply walked out. Not once did Cowboy Bob speak or threaten the teller with a weapon. This became his signature method of bank robbing: silent, not waving a weapon around to intimidate the teller, and always working alone. He tested all of the cash he stole before leaving, and when he was handed a die pack during one of his robberies, he simply gave it back to the teller. His disguise hid almost all of his features, making him essentially unrecognizable. He would cleverly avoid most of the cameras when entering and exiting the bank, and would leave calmly, driving away in his dark orange 1975 Pontiac Grand Prix. Even his car made it impossible to identify him, as the license plates were stolen and changed with every robbery. Every time FBI agents tried to track down the plates, they would ultimately end up frustrated when they inevitably tracked the wrong cars. Steve Powell, an FBI agent assigned to the case, said, "He was making me start to pull my hair out," when describing how Cowboy Bob managed to pull off these nearly flawless robberies.
We didn't have a clue. We were praying for a little break that would give us something to lead us in the right direction.
Authorities had no doubt in their mind that they were dealing with a professional. The only thing Steve Powell could really discern from the surveillance videos was that Cowboy Bob's hat was on backwards and that the beard appeared to be fake. His first 5 robberies were successful, and investigators had no leads that would help identify the mysterious thief. At this point, he had made off with a combined total of around $12,000. But it was his 6th robbery where things would go wrong for him. While law agents were still at the scene of his 5th robbery, they got a call that another bank had been hit by their cowboy hat-clad suspect, and he'd made off with $13,706. The investigators raced to the scene, where eyewitnesses recalled the license plate they'd seen on the Pontiac as it drove off. Investigators traced it as usual, expecting it to be another stolen plate, a dead-end lead. But that wasn't the case this time. Cowboy Bob had gotten sloppy. The license plate led investigators to a man named Pete Tallas, who was working at a Ford factory nearby. When questioned about the vehicle, Pete said he did indeed own it, but he'd given it to his mother and sister because they couldn't afford a car. He didn't believe them when they said it had just been used in a bank robbery. He cooperated with investigators, giving them the address to the apartment where his mother and sister lived. When police arrived, the car was in the parking lot in plain sight. The investigators were about to storm the apartment when they saw a woman walking towards the car. She was dressed casually and looked to be about 50 years old. Assuming it was Cowboy Bob's girlfriend, they allowed her to get in the vehicle and drive around the corner, as they didn't want to be spotted by Cowboy Bob. When she was out of sight of the apartment, they stopped her for questioning, and Steve Powell introduced himself to her. She introduced herself as well, saying her name was Peggy Jo Tallas and that the car was hers. When questioned on where she'd been, she said she'd gone to buy fertilizer at the nursery, which was confirmed upon opening up the trunk and seeing the bag of fertilizer. Investigators requested to look around the apartment, wanting to catch her boyfriend. This made Peggy Jo pause for a moment before answering that there was no one inside except for her elderly mother, who was ill. The investigators drew their guns and burst in anyways, running into Peggy Jo's bedroom. There was no boyfriend in sight, and they were thoroughly confused. Suddenly, they spotted a mannequin head in her bedroom, which was wearing Cowboy Bob's beard and hat. Under the bed, there was a huge sack of cash. Steve Powell immediately began to question Peggy Jo, hoping she would confess where Cowboy Bob was hiding. He said, "Come on, Peggy Jo, you're hiding a man from us." In response, Peggy Jo said, "There isn't any man, I promise you that." Steve Powell stared her down, waiting for her to crack. That's when he noticed that there was small gray dye splotches in her hair and little bits of glue hanging on just above her lip. He suddenly realized the truth. They'd been wrong all along.
And to this day, I remember sitting there, and when I spotted that, boom, finally the light went off with me, and I realized, Jiminy Cricket, this is the bandit.
There was no boyfriend, and it had been Peggy Jo the whole time. She had them all fooled into thinking she was a he by gluing on a mustache, stuffing her stomach with a pillow, and wearing a cowboy hat and sunglasses to hide her face. Steve Powell handcuffed her and read her rights before she was driven to the FBI office downtown for further questioning. The question on everyone's mind was why she did what she did. Steve Powell attempted to question Peggy Jo, but she wouldn't speak to him. She also didn't reveal her reasoning to her court-appointed lawyer. It was only once her attorney hired a psychologist who specialized in evaluating criminals that she admitted why she had begun robbing banks. She said it started as a means of paying for her sick mother's expensive medications. In the 1980s, she had become the sole caretaker of her mother, who had a degenerative bone disease and could barely move from her bed. Peggy Jo became responsible for helping her mother get around the apartment, preparing all her meals, and helping her bathe and take her medication. Shortly after, Peggy Jo injured her back at work. Things got even worse when Peggy Jo was rushed into the hospital for an emergency mastectomy and was herself bedridden for a time. When she was eventually able to work again, she still fell further and further into debt. Even combining her mother's Social Security check and her own paycheck did not cover the staggering medical bills. Even though things were hard, Peggy Jo refused to put her mother in a nursing home. She wanted her to live out the rest of her life as comfortably and dignified as possible. After explaining this, Peggy Jo stated that she had originally only intended on robbing one bank. When asked why she kept going, she shrugged and stared blankly at the wall. The psychologist stated that she was a nice, normal woman, completely unlike any other bank robber he'd interviewed in the past. She never elaborated on why she continued to rob banks, but her friend has speculated that it became too fun for her to just quit. In court, her defense attorney described how out of character the robberies were for Peggy Jo, stating, "At the time of these robberies, Miss Tallas's mother was bedridden, suffering from a severe and chronic degenerative bone disease. Miss Tallas's intense emotional attachment to her mother, coupled with her own chronic mental impairment, prevented Miss Tallas from appreciating the wrongfulness of her actions. The fact that she was unarmed when committing the robberies was also brought up in court. Peggy Jo pled guilty and was given a 33-month sentence. When family visited her in prison, she said nothing about the robberies other than it would never happen again. She also did not speak about the robberies when visited by a true crime author who approached her in prison wanting to collaborate with her on a book. This would have potentially made a lot of money, as the robberies had attracted a lot of news attention. Peggy Jo declined the offer, as she reportedly did not want to bring any more attention and embarrassment to her family. Any requests for interviews from news reporters were also declined. By the time she was out of prison, she was determined to never turn to bank robbery again and turn her life around. She and her mother moved into a townhome where Peggy Jo continued to care for her, helping her eat and bathe. She first got a job as a telemarketer and then as a cashier at the local marina. Her coworkers stated that her cash register never came up short and that she would even use her own money to help out customers who were short on cash. She was all around well liked by the customers, and she would even visit with some of the regulars. At this point, she was in her mid-50s. Things did not remain good for long, however. A few years after Peggy Jo was released from prison, her sister passed away from breast cancer. In December of 2002, her mother passed away in her sleep. Peggy Jo told a coworker that she was glad her mother was no longer suffering, but her heartbreak was evident. At her mother's funeral, Peggy Jo reconciled with her brother Pete, who she had not spoken to in years. She became close with his family again. When asked what she would do now, she simply said she had plans, but she never explained exactly what those plans were. 2 years later, in 2004, Peggy Jo bought an RV off a man at the marina. She gave him $5,900 in cash up front and promised she would pay the remaining $500 as soon as she could. She told her coworker that it was time to move on and said she planned on moving somewhere southern like Mexico to live on the beach like she'd always wanted. Shortly after this, she sold all of her furniture and her car. After giving away a few of her plants to her neighbor, she drove away in her RV, and lived at a public park by a nearby lake. Her life was comfortable, and she spent her days fishing, listening to the radio, and walking along the shore. Her friends visited her occasionally, and one said that this was the life Peggy Jo always wanted to live, one where she was completely free. A few months later, in the summer of 2004, Peggy Jo called her friend Carla, who she worked with at the marina, and left a message asking how she was doing and saying that she was going to hit the road soon. At the end of the message, she said, "No matter what happens to me, always remember that I love you." This alarmed Carla, who sent her husband to check on Peggy Jo at the park and see if she needed help or money. When he arrived, Peggy Jo was already gone. No one knows exactly where Peggy Jo went at this time, but there were numerous unconfirmed sightings of her near various lakes or driving through towns in East Texas. It was around this time that Peggy Jo likely realized that moving to the beach forever meant that she would need a good sum of money. She was 60 at this time, so she still had quite a few years left in her life and would need to support herself somehow. In October of 2004, a bank robbery was reported in Tyler, Texas. The tellers described the robber as an older man with a protruding stomach and scruffy gray facial hair. He reportedly placed a bag on the counter before demanding all of the cash they had and saying no bait bills, no blow-up money. The teller handed over the money and he walked out. No eyewitnesses were able to spot the vehicle as he drove off. When interviewed by FBI agents, a teller described the robber's voice as soft and feminine and mentioned two oddities with his appearance. His mustache looked fake and his stomach looked stuffed. They began to interview older male suspects and have them take lie detector tests. At this point, no one had any idea that their suspect was in fact the 60-year-old Peggy Jo, who had evaded them by speeding off in her RV. Peggy Jo's family also had no idea that she'd returned to robbing banks. Between 2004 and 2005, she kept in contact with them, and they were under the impression that she was doing well and enjoying her life. On May 4th of 2005, she spent some time with her brother Pete, looking at family photos and reminiscing. They hugged each other goodbye before Peggy Jo told him that she would be back on the road again, and Pete said he'd see her soon. But sadly, that wouldn't be the case. The next day, Peggy Jo got dressed in a black long-sleeve shirt and black pants. She applied makeup and brushed her hair before putting on a large, wide-brimmed black hat and sunglasses. She hopped into the front seat of her RV and drove to Tyler, Texas. When she arrived, Peggy Jo parked across the street from the very same bank she'd robbed almost a year earlier. She grabbed a black satchel and walked across the street and into the bank. Peggy Jo walked straight up to the teller and held out the bag while saying, "This is a robbery. I need all of your money. Don't set any alarms." The teller handed over $11,241. This would be enough for Peggy Jo to finally start her new life on the beach in Mexico, and she let her excitement get the best of her, causing a hasty and fatal mistake. She completely forgot to check for a dye pack in the stack of cash, and as she walked out of the doors, ready to head south, the pack exploded and covered her and all of the money in bright red dye. A cloud of smoke trailed her as she ran across the street, desperately trying to make it back to her RV so she could escape. Two witnesses saw her run and called the police. They reported seeing what may have been a man dressed up as a woman fleeing after robbing a bank. Coincidentally, several FBI agents happened to be driving around in search of bank robbers that very day, as there had been a string of bank robberies in the area recently. They quickly headed in Peggy Jo's direction and soon were tailing her as she sped down the highway. The RV was pushed to its limits as Peggy Jo tried to outrun the police. When she headed up a hill, it couldn't keep up its speed. Desperately, Peggy Jo slammed on the brakes and tried to outmaneuver the police by swiveling around into a subdivision. She didn't make it though, and she was surrounded on all sides by police. At this point, the police were not sure who exactly was in the RV, and suspected it could have been a man dressed up as a woman based on the call. The curtains of the RV were closed and they could not see inside, so they made numerous demands for the driver to come out and open the door. Inside the RV, Peggy Jo sat at her little table and smoked a cigarette, no doubt trying to decide what to do now. The money was useless and she was caught with no way to escape. She went into her bedroom where she kept two guns. One was a real gun, and the other was a realistic-looking toy gun she kept in case she needed to threaten someone in a robbery. She grabbed the toy gun and walked to the door. The FBI agents and police officers were shocked to see an old woman approach the door. She shocked them even further by saying, "You're going to have to kill me." One officer, who later underwent counseling due to the trauma and guilt he faced after this event, begged her not to do this. She replied by asking if they would kill her if she came out with a gun, and they continued pleading with her not to do it. but she did it anyways, opening the door and stepping outside with the toy pistol raised. Immediately, 4 officers fired at her. She crumpled forward and collapsed to the ground. Officers believed she may have had 1 or more accomplices, and they tossed tear gas canisters inside before they searched the RV. Finding no one, they grabbed her driver's license and ran a search. This is when they finally realized that their suspect was the infamous Cowboy Bob. The FBI were left with many questions. They wondered if those robberies in the 1990s were truly Peggy Jo's first bank robberies, or if she had gone undetected for many years due to her skill. They also wondered why she had been so careless, speaking and not wearing her disguise. It seemed almost as though she wanted to get caught. The news media went into a frenzy, hounding Peggy Jo's family for information. They all declined to speak, with her brother Pete only saying he didn't understand why she did it. If she needed money, any of them would have been happy to help her. Peggy Jo was given a private burial service attended by her family and a few friends shortly after her death. When one of the agents working on the case told Steve Powell what had happened, he responded, "Say it ain't so."
There was a lot that she did that, I hate to say it this way, but as a bank robber that I respected. I really don't think she would have hurt anybody. So, to hear that she had been shot and killed, it kind of hurt me. I didn't want to hear it, but it was the way things went.
Her incredible and sad story has inspired a song, a play, and a film that is in production at the time of this video. In the end, we end up with more questions than answers about this case. Most notably, the question of why a sweet-natured old woman would continue robbing banks even when she didn't need to. Her friends suspect she did it for the thrill, but we'll never really know. All we're left with is an unbelievable story. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel, and if you have any questions or suggestions, please leave a comment below. I hope to explore more oddities and mysteries with you. Our world is a strange one, and I hope you join me in learning about some of the more curious and eerie happenings. Thank you.